A thin mist drifted low across the forest floor as the columns of Roman legionaries pushed deeper into the Teutoburg Forest. Their armor, dulled by rain, clinked rhythmically as they marched in a long, narrowing line. Horses snorted uneasily, sensing what their riders could not. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine, mud, and something unspoken, dread. At the front rode Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man of senatorial pride and rigid Roman discipline, his expression betraying none of the unease that lingered in his ranks. Varus had been entrusted by Emperor Augustus with governing the newly pacified region of Germania Magna. A political appointee rather than a seasoned general, Varus believed that Roman law and culture could civilize the so-called barbarians beyond the Rhine. He had faced rebellions before, in Syria and Judea, where Roman justice and swift punishment silenced dissent. But Germania was different. Untamed, vast, and full of tribes who pledged loyalty in Latin but spoke treason in whispers. Among Varus's trusted officers was Arminius, a commander of auxiliary cavalry and a prince of the Cherusci tribe. Arminius had been raised in Rome as a hostage-turned-citizen. He wore the Roman uniform and bore the honors of a Roman knight. To Varus, Arminius was the embodiment of Rome's success, a barbarian remade by civilization, loyal to the eagle standard. But Arminius carried a deeper loyalty, one forged not in marble palaces, but in the shadowed glades of his homeland. He had returned not as a subject, but as a spy. That summer, Arminius brought news to Varus of a tribal uprising in the north. Nothing major, he assured. Just another minor flare-up requiring Roman intervention. It was the perfect pretext to draw 3 legions, around 20,000 men, deep into the forest, away from the safety of established roads and fortified camps. Varus, ever confident in his own judgment, accepted the counsel without suspicion. After all, hadn't Arminius proven himself time and again? The forest tightened around them as the column advanced. It had rained for days, turning the ground beneath their feet into thick clay that gripped sandals and hooves alike. The straight lines of Roman military precision became ragged threads unraveling across the terrain. Visibility diminished. Communication between units broke down. Supply wagons lagged behind. And still Arminius urged them forward, promising that the rebels were just ahead. That night, under cover of darkness, Arminius vanished. He had slipped away with his cavalry, supposedly to rally allied tribes in support of the Roman effort. But as dawn broke, his true allegiance would be revealed. Back at the rear of the column, Centurion Cassius Lentulus sensed something wrong. He was a veteran of the Balkan campaigns and had a nose for trouble. The silence of the forest was too complete. No bird song, no rustling from game. It was as if the trees themselves held their breath. He voiced his concerns to his tribune, but was met with irritation and orders to stay in line. After all, who was Cassius to question a campaign led by Varus himself? Still, unease grew. The men whispered that the gods were angry. Some swore they saw shadows moving behind the trees. The newer recruits laughed nervously, while seasoned soldiers tightened their grips on their gladi. The trees seemed to close in, branches entwining like skeletal hands. It was here, in this place of narrowing vision and rising dread, that Rome would face its reckoning. As the legionaries paused to rest, unaware they had entered a carefully planned trap, the Germanic tribes prepared in silence. Hidden in ravines, behind moss-covered boulders and camouflaged shelters, warriors from multiple tribes waited with spears and axes. They wore little armor, but their knowledge of the terrain was their greatest weapon. And they had Arminius, who had walked beside Roman commanders, studied their tactics, and now aimed to break them from within. At midday, a guttural cry shattered the stillness. It was followed by the sudden hiss of javelins and the crash of war cries erupting from every direction. The forest came alive with fury. The Romans, caught off guard, scrambled to form ranks, but the trees allowed no room for maneuver. Discipline broke down in the face of chaos. Arrows rained down, blood soaked into the wet soil. Cassius Lentulus fought like a man possessed, trying to rally his men into formation, but they were being swallowed by the forest and the fury of betrayal. At the front, Varus tried to grasp what was happening. His legions were under attack by the very people he thought he had pacified, led by the man he had trusted most. His pride clouded judgment. Orders were issued, then countermanded. Confusion reigned. The legions, stretched thin and unprepared, were fighting not a battle, but a massacre in slow motion. As night fell and the screams died down, only the crackling of flames and the groans of the wounded remained. The Romans set up a desperate defensive camp, unaware that the nightmare had only begun. Varus stood at the center of it all, drenched not just in rain, but in the bitter taste of betrayal. Around him, the faces of his officers flickered in torchlight, haunted, silent, afraid. Somewhere beyond the trees, Arminius watched. The first blow had been struck. The empire had entered the forest believing in the power of its standards. But here, amid roots and rain and blood, those standards would fall. The reckoning had begun. The rain returned with a vengeance the next morning, turning the makeshift Roman camp into a mire of despair. Mud clung to greaves and soaked into woolen tunics. Fires sputtered uselessly, and the chill pierced even the thickest cloaks. Varus stood over a crude map, its ink smudged by moisture, trying to comprehend the geography of his undoing. Every decision he made the day before seemed now like a thread leading into a noose. Around him, what remained of his command staff debated fiercely. Should they push forward, retreat, or hold their ground? There was no consensus, only confusion. The legions had been trained to fight in open fields, shoulder to shoulder in perfect formation. But the forest refused such order. It devoured formations, silenced horns, and split units into isolated knots that fought blindly. The enemy struck and vanished, not with the honor of open war, but with the cunning of ambush. What Varus had once called barbarism was proving devastatingly effective. Among the surviving officers, Centurion Cassius Lentulus remained a rare voice of clarity. His face was streaked with grime and dried blood, and yet his eyes were alert, always scanning the trees. He had fought in the chaos of Dacia and knew that survival now depended on speed, not pride. He argued for retreat, not toward the front, where the map promised Roman allies, but back toward Aliso, where a fortified garrison might still hold. Varus hesitated, unwilling to abandon the mission, but the howling of distant horns made the decision for him. With grim resolve, the legions began to move again. What was once a disciplined column had become a staggering procession of wounded, weary soldiers and frightened camp followers. The forest grew thicker, the trails narrower. Trees leaned over the path like voyeurs to a slow death march. The Germans were never far. They taunted from the shadows, sounding horns and laughing in voices that echoed eerily through the woods. Psychological warfare, Arminius knew, could break the Romans faster than any blade. Arminius himself moved silently among the warriors. Clad now in native garb, face streaked with earth, he no longer bore the symbols of Roman honor. Those had been cast aside with his oath. Among the tribesmen, he was no longer an auxiliary commander. He was a liberator. His plan was unfolding perfectly. Divide, harass, bleed them dry. Victory would not come in a single clash, but in endless cuts, each more demoralizing than the last. As the Romans entered a narrow ravine, the trap tightened. The Cherusci and allied tribes had prepared this ground in advance. Fallen logs blocked escape routes. Earthworks funneled the legionaries into kill zones. From above, the Germans hurled rocks and spears with chilling precision. Below, Warriors surged in waves, striking and retreating before the Romans could respond. Cassius fought at the front, sword slick with blood, voice hoarse from shouting orders. He saw discipline unraveling. The legions no longer fought as one. Some soldiers dropped their shields and ran into the forest, only to be cut down moments later. Others huddled in place, too terrified to move. He pushed them forward, formed tight knots of resistance, anything to stave off collapse. Then came a moment of heartbreak. Tribune Marcellus, barely 25, whom Cassius had mentored, took a spear through the chest while trying to rally a flank. Cassius dragged him to cover, holding the young man's hand as the life drained from his eyes. "Tell them. We didn't run," Marcellus whispered before going still. Cassius rose slowly, fury replacing grief. They would not die like this, not like cornered prey. Farther up the ravine, Varus watched from a litter. An old leg injury had flared, and now he was borne on the shoulders of guards as if a defeated king. He saw his legions breaking and, worse, felt his own confidence shatter. His world, the Roman world, was built on order, on rules and ranks and roads that led somewhere. But here, nothing obeyed Roman logic. Even the gods seemed distant. By nightfall, fewer than half of the original force remained. They made camp again, though calling it a camp felt generous. It was a shattered circle of men, many wounded, most silent. The moans of the dying echoed in the dark. Fires were forbidden. They would only draw more enemies. And so they sat in the cold, among the dead, staring into the blackness as if waiting for death to step from the trees. Arminius watched from a ridge. He knew the Romans would not last much longer. They were exhausted, leaderless, unraveling. But he would not rush the end. His warriors respected him, but he knew many still doubted whether his defection had been wise. Total victory was the only answer. He would show them that Rome could be beaten, not in one battle, but in the breaking of its myth. On the forest floor, Cassius moved among the survivors, binding wounds, whispering encouragement. He had become the glue holding the remnants together, even as he questioned if they could ever make it out. When he finally knelt in exhaustion beside a fallen log, he heard Varus calling for him. The general's face was pale, hollowed by guilt and exposure. "We cannot let them take me," Varus said flatly. "Not alive." He pressed a dagger into Cassius's hand. Cassius stared at the blade, then at the man who had led them into this nightmare. "You still command us," he said, voice low. "Don't ask me to carry your shame." But Varus said nothing. His eyes closed, and he turned away. The next morning would bring no sunrise, only the dim gray of another desperate march. The forest was closing in, and with it, the fate of 3 legions. The morning mist clung low to the forest floor, thick and unforgiving, muffling footsteps and disguising the direction of sound. For what remained of Varus's legions, this was not a retreat. It was a funeral procession stretched over broken earth. Cassius Lentulus, mud-caked and hollow-eyed, moved at the column's edge, eyes constantly scanning the underbrush. Every rustle could be an ambush, every silence a prelude to death. Varus rode no longer. His litter had been abandoned during the night. Somewhere in the dark, the general had disappeared. Some claimed he'd taken his own life. Others whispered that he had tried to flee, to buy mercy from Arminius with information. Either way, no one expected to see him again. His absence was a wound, but not an unexpected one. Cassius had long sensed the man's breaking point. Now, with no official command left, Cassius acted on instinct. Survival was no longer tied to rank, only to resolve. The men looked to him, what few there were. Legionaries without standards, cohorts without leaders. Young faces, older than their years, smeared with soot and streaked with desperation. They moved westward, toward the distant hope of Aliso, clinging to the idea that Roman banners still flew somewhere beyond the trees. Arminius, however, would not allow escape. He understood the power of annihilation. A massacre would echo from the Rhine to the Tiber. As the sun tried to pierce the canopy, a sudden blast of horns shattered the illusion of calm. From both flanks, Germanic warriors poured into the clearing. Spears rained down like hail. The Romans fought desperately, forming ragged circles, shields raised, blades drawn. Cassius shouted orders, not knowing if anyone heard. He swung his gladius, each strike a plea to the gods, each parry a miracle. Blood soaked the ground, German and Roman alike. The fighting was chaos. There was no line, no formation, only men grappling, stabbing, screaming. A young Optio named Rufus fell beside Cassius, his throat slashed by a blade carved from bone. Cassius didn't flinch. He had become numb to the dying. All he could do was keep his men moving. West, always west. Then the forest split open into a wide glade, and there, for the first time in days, they saw open sky. A clearing, a chance. Cassius led what remained, perhaps 200 men into the space, calling for a defensive circle. The Romans complied, exhausted but obedient. Shields overlapped, spears bristled outward. The Germans hesitated. Across the clearing, Arminius emerged. His armor was a mix of Roman craftsmanship and tribal flair, iron mail, leather strips, painted symbols of war. He stood tall, confident, and for the first time he made no effort to hide. He had earned this moment. Cassius saw him, recognized him, the traitor, the architect of the slaughter. Rage flared in his chest. "You trained with us," Cassius growled under his breath. "You bled with us." Now Arminius raised a hand, signaling his warriors to wait. Then he stepped forward alone, toward the Roman circle, unarmed. Cassius moved to meet him, sword still drawn. At 10 paces, Arminius stopped. "You can't win," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Lay down your weapons. I will spare those who surrender." Cassius laughed bitterly. "Spare us? After all this, you slaughtered thousands of men you once called brothers?" Arminius's expression didn't change. "They were never my brothers. Rome educated me, but it also taught me what it does to those it rules. Subjugation is not kinship." Cassius spat in the dirt. "You think this will end Rome? We will come back, tenfold." "I expect nothing less," Arminius said quietly. "But not today." Cassius raised his blade. "Then come and finish it." Arminius nodded once, then turned his back and walked away. A strange gesture, perhaps of respect, perhaps of pity. But Cassius knew what it meant. They would not be spared. And they weren't. The last Roman stand in the Teutoburg Forest lasted less than an hour. When the Germanic war horns sounded again, it was like the earth itself roared. The tribes came from all sides, a tidal wave of vengeance. Cassius fought until he could no longer lift his arm, until the blood in his eyes made enemies and friends indistinguishable. He didn't feel the wound that finally brought him down, only the cold of the ground as it rushed to meet him. By nightfall, the clearing was silent. Bodies lay where they had fallen, shields splintered, standards broken. There were no survivors. The eagles of the legions, symbols of Rome's might, had been captured or hidden in the dirt. Arminius stood over the field, wind lifting his hair, eyes distant. He had done what no man before him had managed. He had shattered 3 Roman legions and brought the empire to its knees in a single forest. But he felt no triumph, only the weight of inevitability. Rome would return, and it would remember. Back in Rome, months later, news of the disaster arrived like a thunderclap. The Emperor Augustus reportedly struck his head against a wall in despair and cried, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" But no one could. They were gone, lost to the mist and trees of Germania. Teutoburg was not the end of Rome, but it changed everything. It drew a line across the map of empire, a frontier that would never be crossed again with the same arrogance. The forest had taught the mightiest empire on earth that some lands could not be tamed, and some betrayals echo for eternity.